These are my 5 bold free agency predictions. With the NBA draft just ending and NBA free agency right around the corner, I'm going to be talking about 5 different bold predictions that I think will happen in this year's free agency class. But quickly, before we get the video started, for those of you who may not know, I'm Juicy Sports, I make opinionated NBA content, and if you guys enjoy videos similar to this, hit that subscribe button, that like button, and that post notification bell. I also want to quickly mention that I recently started up an MMA channel, and if you guys are interested in that, the link will be in the description. But anyways, let's get into it. NBA free agency is a very fun time. This is a time where NBA teams get a lot better, and unfortunately some other teams get a lot worse due to superstars moving teams. And although this free agency class isn't necessarily as stacked as we're used to seeing in the past, I still think that this class has the potential to have explosive moves. And in this video, we're going to be going over a couple different potential moves that I think could happen in this free agency class. And the first one that I want to touch upon is Jalen Brunson to the New York Knicks. So it's been no secret for some time that the Knicks need a point guard, and Jalen Brunson has been atop of their list for some time now, dating all the way back to the beginning of last season. But after Jalen Brunson's performance in the playoffs last year for the Mavericks, a lot of those rumors started to die down due to the fact that most people thought that the Dallas Mavericks would be guaranteed to re-sign him because he performed so well in the playoffs. But after the season did end, and after some of the moves that the Knicks did make, especially on draft day, the rumors are starting to come back due to the fact that the Knicks would be willing to offer Brunson an over $100 million contract, and also made some other moves that would be enticing for Jalen, like signing his dad as an assistant head coach. And it's gotten to a point where recently a lot of people are expecting the Knicks to get Jalen Brunson. Now, I really do think this move makes a lot of sense for both sides. It makes a lot of sense for Jalen because he would be coming back home. He would also be playing for his dad on the coaching staff. He would be playing with a much younger team, and he would most likely be getting a much bigger role in New York than he did in Dallas. Now, of course, it also makes a ton of sense for the Knicks because they would finally be getting that franchise point guard that they've been needing for so long. Or if he's not necessarily a franchise point guard, he would at the very least be an all-star type guy for sure. He would also help a bunch of different players on this Knicks roster, specifically RJ Barrett and Obi Toppin. And overall, in my opinion, I just think it would be a great fit for Jalen Brunson to play in New York with this current squad that they do have. Now, the next guy that I want to touch upon is Kevin Durant. When KD and Kyrie originally signed with the Nets a few seasons back, the prevailing thought was both of those guys would play with Brooklyn for the rest of their careers, or at the very least for a very long time. But after the Nets have struggled in the playoffs the previous 2 seasons, on top of all the drama that Kyrie Irving has been going through over this past season and a half, it's been a lot less likely that KD would stay with the Nets long term. And recently there has been some rumors of Kevin Durant potentially going to Portland, as Damian Lillard did post it on his story. And even besides that, there were a few rumors on that. But one thing that I will say, Kyrie Irving recently did say he will opt into his contract with Brooklyn. So assuming Kyrie doesn't get traded by the Nets and he stays with them, I would say it's a lot more likely that KD does stay with Brooklyn, at least for this season. But at the same time, he hasn't formally said that he would stay with Brooklyn this season, so it still is somewhat up in the air at this point. Now, I think this move makes a lot of sense for both sides. It would make a lot of sense for KD because he would be playing next to a guy in Damian Lillard who has all the talent in the world. And although Kyrie also has all the talent in the world, there's a ton of drama that does go along with his name, and the fact that the Nets weren't able to really win for the past few seasons might tell KD all he needs to know, and he could just potentially be fed up with the situation in Brooklyn. Now, also, if KD did move to Portland, it could potentially fix his reputation, or at the very least help it, although I don't necessarily think he cares about that all that much. But from Portland's perspective, of course this would make a ton of sense. The Blazers would finally be getting Damian Lillard the help that he does need, and would make the Blazers a legitimate championship contender instantly when you have guys like both Damian Lillard and Kevin Durant on your roster. Now, of course, you probably would have to move a bunch of different players on your team, which definitely would not help their depth whatsoever. But at the same time, whenever you have an opportunity to get a player like Kevin Durant, you always take it. And especially considering that the Blazers have been in this mediocre state stage for basically ever since Dame has been on the team, this is definitely a move that would benefit them tremendously. Now, the next player that I want to touch upon is Zach Lavine. Now, when Zach originally got to Chicago, he's been a phenomenal player for them, and especially in this previous season, he's been amazing. But when the season did end for Chicago, the prevailing thought was Lavine would instantly re-sign with Chicago, and still at this point, I would say most people still do think the Bulls will end up re-signing Lavine. But recently, Zach has made some comments that would lead you to believe that he's not necessarily a slam dunk to re-sign with Chicago, and there is a possibility that he could go elsewhere. And the potential team that I think he could go to is the Miami Heat. And this would of course be an assign and trade deal, which the Heat have proven the ability to be very good at, as they did get Jimmy Butler that way as well, when they barely had any cap space. Now, this move would make a ton of sense for Zach Lavine, as he would have a much better opportunity to win an NBA championship in Miami than he would have in Chicago, at least in my opinion, especially when you're playing with guys like Jimmy Butler and Tyler Hero, and playing in Miami, who has a phenomenal coaching staff and just a phenomenal culture in general. And of course, it would also make a ton of sense for Miami, as they would be bringing in another star to their organization, which of course always helps, but also they really did need another ball handler and another scorer on their team, which of course Zach Lavine would be for them. So I think this would be a perfect move for the Miami Heat. Now, the next player that I want to touch upon is Bradley Beal. So it's been a very interesting situation for Bradley Beal and the Washington Wizards. When you watch Beal on the court, it seems like he's making it so obvious that he doesn't want to be in Washington, but when you hear his comments off the court and when you see what he's been doing over the past few off seasons, he's always made it clear that he wants to stay with Washington for the rest of his career. So it's kind of been an interesting situation to say the least. But this is probably the first offseason that Bradley Beal hasn't necessarily said that he wants to stay with Washington for the rest of his career, and at the very least, he's left the door open slightly for him potentially leaving Washington. So for this bold prediction, I have Bradley Beal going to the Memphis Grizzlies. Now, in my opinion, this move would make a ton of sense for Bradley Beal, as obviously he would have a much better chance of winning a championship in Memphis than he would have in Washington, and also he probably would have a lot more fun as well, as the Grizzlies have been one of the more fun teams to watch in the NBA, and playing alongside a guy in Ja Morant would probably make his life a lot easier in Beal's, and also probably a lot more fun as well. But now it would also make a ton of sense for the Grizzlies, as they would be bringing in a legitimate scorer in Bradley Beal and giving a ton of help to Ja Morant as well, which would probably be most beneficial once it comes down to the playoffs, which is somewhere that the Grizzlies haven't necessarily been amazing in, I would say. Although of course they haven't necessarily been bad in the playoffs either. But bringing in Beal would definitely help them tremendously at that point. But now the last player that I want to touch upon on this video is Malcolm Brogdon. So I mentioned before in the video that I had Jalen Brunson going to the New York Knicks. So the flip side of that is the Mavericks obviously would need to find someone to replace Brunson, and that player could potentially be Malcolm Brogdon. Now, Brogdon is probably one of the most underrated players in the NBA, mostly due to the fact that he can't stay healthy. And that certainly is his biggest negative, but when he does stay healthy, he's actually a really good player. He's a great shooter from that three-point range. He's a good shooter from that mid-range as well. He can finish around the basket. He's a good passer and playmaker. He's a good defender. And although he's not necessarily an all-star or a superstar type guy, although I would say at his best he is pretty close to an all-star guy, he still is a phenomenal talent. And if he could stay healthy, he would be a phenomenal player for the Dallas Mavericks. But of course, similar to a lot of other players, that's the biggest key for him, health. But this move would of course make a ton of sense for Malcolm Brogdon, as he would have a much better chance of winning a championship in Dallas than he would in Indiana, as the Pacers are obviously rebuilding at this point. But also playing next to a guy in Luka Doncic would just make Malcolm's life a lot easier out there as well. And of course, he has the capability of being a spot-up three-point shooter as well, which is something that he probably would need to utilize a lot more than he did in Indiana in Dallas. But it would also make a ton of sense for the Dallas Mavericks, as if they were to lose Jalen Brunson, they would then instantly bring in another guy who has somewhat of a similar skill set and would definitely be a very good player for them when healthy. But those are my 5 bold predictions for this year's free agency. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you guys agree with my list or do you not agree? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, check one of these 2 videos popping up now, and until the next time, peace out guys.